Hi, everyone. My name is Ankit, and I'm the co-founder and CTO at Postman. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you all about our growth story. Uh, right, why am I here? Some of these numbers that I just wanted to bring about. So currently, Postman has 3.5 million users. Yes, it's a product that's based completely out of Bangalore and made out of Bangalore. Now, we also have 3 offices based out of Bangalore, San Francisco, and Austin, across a team size of 25. Postman is also used by 30,000 companies in the world, at least the ones that I know of. 61 of the Fortune 100, 9 of the top 10 cloud companies, 9 of the largest retailers, 6 of the 10 largest manufacturing companies, 3 of the big 4 accounting firms, and 8 of the largest 10 telecom. Now, the question is, how did we get here? Right? So I'm just going to talk about first what our ecosystem is, what our industry is, and then I'm going to talk about our own growth story and our experience and what we learned from it. Postman is used everywhere. This is a Google Analytics screenshot that I took yesterday. And up until last year, we had this little small portion in Sahara Desert somewhere where we weren't used, but otherwise you can see it's all blue. Every single country in the world has users from Postman. And I think that's great. I think this is for me, this is the biggest success is this part and nothing else. But before I talk about Postman itself, I want to spend some time and talk about APIs for those who don't know what an API is. So for this, I'll illustrate with the example of a Philips Hue. So Philips Hue is a bulb that I use all over our offices, and the objective of Philips Hue is that you can change these lights based on programmatic input. For example, I can say, open up my Philips Hue app and say that, OK, I want this particular room to have this distribution of colors which looks like a sunset. Or I can play a song, and along with the waves that I have for the music, the lights are flickering around the room. And that's great. It's a beautiful product. Right? It works really well. But how does it really work? So a Philips Hue, or any such IoT device that you talk about, it has an API exposed with it. Now, API is a language by which the bulb tells how the bulb should be instructed to perform a particular action. So the language will say that, OK, if you pass me this particular information in this particular structured format, I will change and take the color green. Or I can isolate different aspects of the bulb itself. Right. So obviously, APIs are not restricted to just IoT. They are everywhere. Your mobile apps, your websites, and any such device. I have toothbrushes, actually, that connect via API and tell me, send me a reminder at 10 a.m. that, OK, to brush your teeth. As I said, APIs are everywhere. I want to spend some time in this slide and just talk about the early growth part. So between 2000 and 2010, I think Amazon, and in particular Jeff Bezos, was the biggest trigger for the growth of APIs. 2004, he's like, OK, Amazon is not scaling. Anyway, we're not doing that well in the stock market. Let's just build out a structure for the larger ecosystem where our systems will scale. So they broke down their systems, and every instruction was, if you're running a team, and what they call as the 2 pizza teams, you are building a product where you can, the only way that somebody else can integrate with you is via this thing called as an API. And that drove the adoption for APIs 100%. This initial curve up until 2010 is completely, very heavily driven by companies like Amazon and, of course, leaders like Jeff Bezos. 2010 is a very landmark year because this is a time around which iPhone 3G came out and the App Store came out. And with the smartphone revolution, apps required APIs to be running in the background. And it just made more sense because instead of writing dedicated code that ran inside your mobile apps or your websites, you could now write APIs to which websites, apps could talk to. And of course, as that grew further, now you can see this exponential growth, and as that grew further, more and more apps come out, and more of these IoT devices come out. Projections at least around 2022, if I'm not wrong, are around 50 billion IoT devices, which is phenomenal. Right. One number that I probably want to focus on in this particular thing is the one in present, which says 10 million internal APIs. So APIs are something that companies sell. APIs are something that are used to build out apps. But the fact of the matter is, for most companies, 99% of these APIs are internal APIs, that they are private APIs. They are not exposed to external consumers. They are not even shared on your website. But they take care of the entire infrastructure to work in the background. And up until very recently, surprisingly, not many companies were addressing the problem of development of internal APIs, of management of internal APIs. Most of the API companies that came out circa 2009 onwards were primarily focused at your external APIs, at your end user goals of API performance. And I'll come back to that part and why that is important. Right. Postman had its origins back in 2009. This is me and my co-founder. in our days when we were a lot thinner, a lot more hair in some case on their head, a lot less hair in some case on their faces. And we met back in 2009 at Yahoo. This was our first job. And we were working on a front end that would break every day because, again, internal APIs are extremely transient. They change every single day, as many of the developers in this audience would know. So the front end would break every day, and people would come to me and say, hey, you broke it. And I'm like, not really. I didn't even change anything. I was on leave yesterday, right? But the idea was because APIs were changing so often, our front end would break. And there was no system, and it was extremely crude, rudimentary technology to actually manage these APIs. And that's where I think the idea sort of germinated, because as we progressed further in our careers, like I went somewhere else and Abhinav went in another job, we realized that these problems just existed everywhere. So problems outlining being that as software and developers and devices got more and more connected, developers were not getting connected, because developers were using systems like chat, email, source control, which were not necessarily designed keeping the API audience or the API use cases in mind. And again, nobody, until very, very recently. In fact, Postman, I think, has sort of pioneered that particular part, is addressing the problem of internal APIs. And just to outline what an API process looks like, at least in our opinion, is that API process includes these stages. And the reason why I put it out in a circle and not necessarily in a straight line is because API development is very feedback loop oriented. Like, I can't build an API and then forget about it. Like, it has to improve and iterate over time, at least good APIs. And that's why it starts from the process of API design, but goes into development, testing, usage, and so on. And then all of this feeds back into the design process. So first version of Postman. And this is where I would probably want to spend a little bit of time about the history of Postman itself. So 2012 is when me and my co-founder, and then this time we were in Noida, and we were just sitting, and we were still struggling with the same problems with API management, that APIs would change and our front end would break, or the tooling was clunky. And of course, all of us were building APIs at the time. So we just sat down over a weekend and wrote down a very, very simple version. This is not exactly the first version, maybe like second or third. But the idea was, it was super simple. It was just a form. And it was form on top of this Unix tool called as curl, which allowed you a simple UI to make API calls. And that itself, we just wrote it down. We used it internally for ourselves. And then we just published it and open sourced it to the world. Putting it on the timeline. So 2012, first version of the Chrome store. And obviously, this was like 0.5, like 0.25 of my time and 0.25 of my co-founder's time, and we just put out the first version. Surprisingly, in between March, when we put it out, and December, we had 50,000 users. And these are people from all over the world, like Nigeria, China, and US, of course, US and India. And this was literally, at this point, was being built by half a developer, which was primarily my co-founder, who was working on his other startup, and then he was just a little disillusioned, so he was working on this on the side. And 50,000 users, I think, was a pretty big number, because out of nowhere, out of like people not even working 100% on this product at a time, and just put it out for the open source community to consume, and it gained traction. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a little detail, but the idea is that it gained traction primarily because of the fact that this was a product that was written for a need that we understood. We wrote it for ourselves, and there were people who had similar problems and similar iterations that they were facing, and that's why this growth number came up. In August of 2013, random point in between, when actually this was the point at which I started contributing a little bit more to the product development, and then we had like 0.725 plus 0.25, like one single developer supporting 100,000 users, which of course we used to get like a ton of feedback. Like at GitHub, every day we would get like 50 requests. These are the features that I want, and it was like a very nice, fun community to talk to, because people with like-minded ideas wanting to develop and improve a product that was just out there for the world to consume. This was not a commercial endeavor at all at the time. This was just primarily that we built something that thought would help us. It did. And we put it out for the world to consume because they thought it'll help them, and hopefully it did. Right? October 2014, and the reason why I marked this properly is because at that time is when we launched Postman, the company. We decided, OK, enough of our existing jobs. There is, obviously, like apart from the fact that it's a good product, which a lot of people across the world, 600,000 users at the time, it probably has monetary value. And it does because it is solving an actual problem. The problem of improving developer productivity. The problem of improving communication across developers building these extremely complex systems through extremely clunky tooling. And at this time, we grew from 2 to 3, and we were 3 founders. And that's one more thing that I want to mention here, and that's important, is that at this point, the story is how we raised money. Like, we actually never thought about raising money at the time, and we got cold called a little bit through investors, which are primarily because of this one thing, which is traction. There is no substitute for traction, whether you're fundraising, whether you're talking about products, like nothing. Like 600,000 users built by 1.5 people, and that itself is a number that spoke for it. And we pretty much like just woke up one day in Bombay. I mean, my founder even had like scruff jeans, and I was not wearing chappals at the time. And we went to a VC meeting, and we raised $1 million. And I think it was great. Nothing to do with us, nothing to do with anything else, except for the fact those 600,000 numbers all over the world. And that is super important. Again, I can't stress traction, user traction enough. And we'll come to how we thought about gaining that traction and how we eventually did it. March 2015 is we launched our first paid product, Postman Cloud, which again sort of stemmed back from our original need for collaboration. That is, for all of us to be aware or cognizant of the current state of the API at the current point in time, which means as different stakeholders, and APIs are not just consumed by developers. APIs are used by end consumers, our customers, our technical writers, and everywhere. In around 2013, actually, we had Box.com, which is one of the biggest storage companies in the world, who published a blog post about how their sales engineers were using Postman. And I think that was great validation for us. And that time, of course, we had grown a little bit in the usage numbers, and we also had hired 2 employees. I think segueing from the last talk here is that the importance of design cannot be understated. And that, at that point, what we wanted to focus on is a product that was well-designed and was simple. Because one thing that we've realized and discovered is that developer tools are usually hard. And they don't need to be. They don't need to be complex. It's just because complex is because developers are, in general, like, I mean, of course, like an elite category. They're like smart people. And smart people think that smart tooling is supposed to be complex because the harder it is to consume, the harder it is, the more emotional ability or emotional response I get as a developer from consuming it because it's harder. I think we took a different approach. And we took on certain competitors like SmartBear, for example, who had this tool called Soap UI, which I'm sure a lot of you used at this time. Right? And really, really hard to use. Good product, of course, it has survived like 10 years of usage, but really, really hard to use. So we focused, the first hire we have made was a designer, not a developer. And this is, again, while we were serving 1 million users with like their data on our cloud systems. Right? And the idea was to make sure that there is inherent simplicity in our products. That products don't need to be hard to consume to make meaningful things out of. And then finally, I mean, just to cover up that part now, is that now we are at 3.5 million users, we have 3 offices, and we have 25 employees spread across 3 cities. And I think that's good progress. Just outlining this growth number here, and this slightly like exponential curve that you see over time is attributed to these factors. And I'm going to talk about this in certain stages. Let's talk about the earliest stage, which is September 12 to 13. And that growth I primarily attribute to need. To the need where product is built to satiate our own need. Right? It was a product that was built by developers for developers and open source to the world. And we let people build on top of our creation, help them to generate ideas, or they helped us to generate ideas which were eventually incorporated into the product. And open sourcing just harbored this entire community of people who loved Postman. And that was great because we were discovered by passionate, like-minded people or innovators or early adopters that you might call it. And the product grew organically, primarily through word of mouth and nothing else. We had no marketing spend that was done on this. In fact, up until, I would say, 6 months ago, we have had $0 spent on marketing or sales. And this is primarily because of the power that the product or the emotion that the product generates in people, which is in a large part attributed to this initial discovery by like-minded people where we were extremely responsive to support channels. And every time somebody would raise a ticket, and we would appreciate that, take their pull request, modify it, spend some time on it, and give great importance to user feedback. And one thing that worked for us, and I think that was great, is because we didn't have a business model in mind. It was not there. Like it's hard to think about how do you make money in the beginning when you didn't even have a product. Like it was a product that was built for us. It was to solve our problem. And it's important to understand, that at least for me, it's not important to like go looking out for the problem. It's important to actually go and see that there is a problem that we are going to solve, and then how we're going to solve it. And then the monetization part comes much, much later, at least in our case, and that worked great. The other aspect is virality. So as the product grew, which was around, let's say, September or August 2013, we discovered that people were talking more and more about Postman. But what they needed actually was a way to not just make these API calls, but also structure these API calls, group these API calls into an entity that made sense. And this is actually a feature request from a user that, hey, I'm making all these calls, and then I go into this other tab, and now I replay old requests that I've made. What I want to do is I want to structure them and store them, or in a way, in a newer parlance, document them. So we introduced this feature called as a Postman collection, which allowed you to group these requests into a meaningful entity, requests that made sense together, and into an object called as a Postman collection, which was a JSON format that you could share with the world. It was a completely open source format. People could contribute. People contributed to the development of the format itself. And then we gave them an entity from within the application to actually share this object with the community. Now, this built inherent virality into the product, because to consume this collection, you needed to have Postman installed. And then this growth curve that you see here is primarily attributed to the fact that I wanted to share the collection, or I wanted to let other people consume my APIs, and the way to do it is to share a collection. And it works great, because you're building collections for yourself. You're not taking the extra effort of writing documentation code for other people. I'm building something that improves my own workflow and improves my own productivity, and which is why introducing this aspect of sharing just adds a very easy layer for us to actually incorporate a growth metric or a growth trigger called virality. So as I said, it was a natural progression for the product. It was not something that was designed for building virality in mind. And that's kind of important to maintain that. So you build share buttons, and like there's share buttons everywhere. Right? But like the point is that it makes sense because it improves the core workflow for the developer. It improves the core workflow for the user rather than being there for the sake of sharing. We open sourced the format. The community contributed in building the format itself. And at this point, Postman collection is the most popular API documentation format in the world, like by far. Like there's not even close. I think maybe by measure of like 7 to 10 times is how big it is. 2.5 million plus APIs that exist inside our cloud platform. And outside our cloud platform, there are still like 2 million other users, which are God knows how many number there would be. Then comes the interesting part, and this is where love for the product played a big role, is advocacy. And because we were so responsive to user feedback and the way we built the product, like in spite of what we were doing in otherwise, and as developers that were actually committed to external pressures, which are not 100% working on this product. So we had advocacy through individuals. We would respond to customer queries and build products, and products that people love, and they would talk about it. And we have this whole thing called as the Postman Wall of Love, where people who tweet about Postman and have done since 2012 is just like there for everybody to see. And it's great, because this is how Postman spread, as I said, through word of mouth. Advocacy by influencers, and that is super important. And it's important to reach out the influencers the right way. Influencers are people who will talk about the product for you and have a much greater impact than advocates who are generally talking only within their own social network. We had NASA talking about how much they love Postman. And that was great. That was obviously like a really cool thing to say, that NASA uses Postman, but it was great because this itself got a lot of traction. Box in 2013 posted this post about Postman, which is a developer's best friend, and that was really good because it was really, really powerful. This MVP at Microsoft, Scott Hanselman, in December of 2013, spoke about how Postman is like a TiVo for your APIs. And that itself, that article got us so much traction, right? So again, because we reached out to these people at the right time through the community, it was not forced down their throat that, okay, use Postman, it's that great. It was because people within their own network were consuming it through advocacy by other developers that they got to hear about it, they got to know about it, and then they spoke about it. And when they spoke, the network effect, and we were able to achieve some sort of a critical mass. And this, I think, is one of my favorite things, is the Microsoft presenters really like using the Postman Chrome extension, right? So if everybody on the stage, when they come to any developer conference and they come and open this particular app, who is the audience, right? They're developers. They'll come and they download the product and they'll use it. And that really worked well for us, which is why we also tweaked, and at a certain time we realized that this is a very, very important medium for growth. So feature discovery through growth or through user feedback is when we see tweets like this, that people are broadcasting Postman on top of their screens. Why not make the presentation to be an important feature of a developer tool, which is not necessarily the case. It's meant for keynotes and PDFs, not necessarily for developer tools, right? And this got a significant growth, things like these. Okay, advocacy through affiliation. So this is sort of like a campaign that we ran earlier this year, and this is what we call as the Run in Postman button. So we discovered that people were sharing collections. And they really like sharing collection. They were doing it through these little links that were presented all over the internet. So what we did is we decided to run our first marketing effort, and build this little button called Run in Postman. Now, there are multiple plays as to why this thing works. Obviously, 3.5 million developers, which is almost, out of 18 million developers worldwide, is a big percentage, right? You take down the number of API developers, that number goes down. So it's essential for brands to sort of like incorporate these kind of ways of consuming their APIs. The other thing is with API documentation in general, APIs are developed. API documentation has traditionally been like reference documentation. Like I come to a website and I'm able to look at all these little manuals of how to do things, but it's not necessarily how to do things. It's like if I'm looking for something very, very particular, I can go find it. But if I come to an API documentation website and then I look at how do I really play around with it, right? If I go to, let's say, Twitter search documentation, I want to first be able to sign up, then sign in, and then I want to be able to make a search tweet. And that's the idea. So what we position this little button, this simple little button as, is a way for developers to consume not reference documentation, but scenarios, where the scenarios are something that are abstracted away from the core documentation of, let's say, Best Buy or Square or whoever, and hidden inside these Run Postman buttons. So if I want to look and play with these scenarios, I can go there and play. And it's a huge success. We got some of the biggest brands in the world. I'm only listed 4 here, but like Run Postman buttons are hosted, I think, on some 500 different API documentations worldwide. And I think that's great, because this gives us great product growth. And at the same time, through affiliation, it's advocacy. And this is instant validation, right? Best Buy, Square, Amazon, Postmates, all of these massive, massive companies putting these buttons on their documentation. And any developer who comes there is like, OK, this is awesome. OK, now, this was super important. So critics. So obviously, over the years, it's not just been like, like I love your product. It's been a lot of critical attribution to us as well. Every time we would probably launch this simple product and maybe launch like a UI change or a little change to our workflow, we would have a lot of criticism. Or even in general, like people would come from other systems and they would say, like, Postman does not do this. I had this one email from this New Zealand professor which had come last year when we launched like a major redesign. And this guy emailed, I'm guessing in a drunken stupor, but what he basically said is that you have destroyed my life, right? And I'm like, this is an API tool. Like, I don't think, how have I destroyed your life, right? And then like a big, big, big email, like crossing 2 pages if I had to print it out, is about how this tool is something that I used to recommend all the time, and now you've changed this, I don't understand, and you have just destroyed my life. Like, I'm going to stop using this, I'm going to stop advocating it. So what we do is we actually have special love reserved for critics. And I think that's super important, because critics are the ones who are the most passionate users of your product. And these are the guys who have advocated your product in the past, and now they feel at least in the case of this guy, they feel personally let down. That I have been talking to all my class, this New Zealand professor, I've been talking to my entire class, use this product, and now you've given me this, and I hate it, right? So what we do is, our objective has always been to pay special attention to critics and turn them into admirers and finally into advocates. And that is something that has happened from the beginning of time of Postman's existence, right from 2012. Through this, and mostly all of our staunchest advocates that exist within organizations have initially been critics of the product. And it's because they have been taken aback by the reaction time and the response time in not just acknowledging the email, but actually incorporating that feedback into the product. The New Zealand professor I mentioned, of course, we took that feedback in play, we assessed it with the rest of the community's reaction, and made sure we launched a product a month later, which was like addressing most of the concerns that were raised. For us, it was a big change, because suddenly we had gone from 2 people thinking about how a product should work to a company, and we were obviously incorporating more and more ideas, and there are some inconsistencies that play around at that time. And these advocates for us have existed, I mean, in box, like from way, and these are like one of the earliest companies who gained massive adoption for Postman, which is Box, Microsoft, and eBay. Uh, then the other thing that I want to mention here is the bottom-up approach. So Postman is a product that was built for developers. Now, most of the API companies that I mentioned have typically looked at external APIs. It's because with the pressure of, let's say, business models in the beginning, or with the pressure of just the fact that you can look at, revenue, you look at revenue for things that companies pay for right away, right up front. Because I am looking at how my API is performing to the external world, I am willing to pay to make sure that it keeps performing over time. As I said, not many people have approached internal APIs, which is 99% of most of the company's markets. Right? So we had a bottom-up approach, which is primarily, it was not that some great little strategy document that we had in the beginning. It was basically because we were solving a need for ourselves. And what this bottom-up approach allows us to do is that make sure that all the end consumers of the product already knew about it, already used it, right? And then when the time came to upsell, and it just became so much easier to market to CXOs, to VPs, because all the end consumers of the product were already using the product. And now when I go to a CXO and he goes and talks to his middle manager that, okay, I heard about this thing, this company approached me, Postman. They're like, oh yeah, we already use it. All of us use it all the time. And that just made the product like so much easier to advocate. And all of these advocates that I mentioned, the critics turned advocates, are now, even on our internal Slack channels, they contribute with great ideas, they beta test our products before they go out to the market, and then they advocate within an organization. And I think this has been super important in the way that we have grown, particularly within organizations. Finally, the last aspect of growth has been customer success. So we have been focused on excellent customer support, and that's been important for the growth of Postman itself. That from day one, whether we were 0.5 developers, whether we were 3 founders, whether we were a team of 25, it doesn't matter, even at a team of 25, if a problem comes, I make sure that I respond immediately so that the problem is addressed as soon as possible. And this good support has fostered loyalty and induced conversions, of course. Like, even scenarios where we have completely screwed up, like we've lost somebody's data in one case, and this guy said, okay, like, what the hell, I just paid you a lot of money, and you've lost all my data, like, what is this? And we made sure we recovered it as soon as possible, right? And that immediately induced conversion. And I think the response there was that everything else is fine, but just the fact that you have responded means that you really care. And just the fact that you care, I'm going to continue paying. I don't want to cancel my subscription, right? And that's great. And the other thing that is important is that our users have been a greater source of ideas. People talk about, like, we don't have any managers in our organization at all till now. In fact, I think I'm the only MBA and I'm doing a technology role. So the idea is that our customers have been our biggest source of idea. Product management has been triggered by customer input from users over GitHub, over Twitter, over email. In fact, even if somebody had to, I shouldn't say this here, but like if somebody had to build a competing product to Postman, just go through a GitHub channel to build everything that the people have asked for, you will probably beat us if you can ship it to market faster. It's fantastic. And only now we are building a customer success team. Up until now, it's been supported by half a developer, it's been supported by 3 founders, and it's obviously now supported by the entire team. And through, tools like Slack and other external integrations, we'll be able to manage this, right? But we make sure that the entire team is privy to everything that is going on within the organization from an external stimulus, either good or bad, all the time. Because we want all of our developers, everybody who joins our team, to make sure that they know that how the product is performing. And I think customer success, and I know everybody says that users are important, listening to users is important, but responding to users in a timely fashion, in a meaningful fashion, and in a way that you show that you care, and that's how you foster loyalty. That's how you foster advocacy. And that inherently we just hired from day one. And that's anybody who joins our team now goes through like a little culture code, where the first thing is transparency, and the second thing is user above everything else. In fact, all these great users, all these great advocates have actually fostered themselves into their own self-sufficient community, where, again, we have basically managed to turn our loyal users into customer support by all of them responding to communities. And this is like a really vibrant community. Anybody has any question, anybody just comes there and shows this. Yeah, finally, this is Postman. I think one of the biggest compliments that we get all the time, I think that was the introduction was also about, is that I can't believe that Postman is an Indian company. Now, that's a great compliment, of course, because, and that stems from, I think it stems from multiple aspects. It stems from product design, where we have focus of simplicity. It stems from customer support, where we have really, really taken care of our users and made sure that they are given extreme priority over everything else. And of course, other factors. The factor is like everybody consumes it. I'm sure like some people or most people in this room would also have heard about Postman in the past, right? And that's great, and that awareness is hard to come by. But that's a very unfortunate statement to hear, right? I mean, we did this, and we did this with like half a person. We did like one person. We did 1.5 people, right? And it's not hard. Like, I mean, I'm hoping that this becomes like an example for people to build product companies out of India, right? There are great e-commerce companies. There are great services companies, and that's awesome. But product companies, I mean, there are a few examples, of course, but it's unfortunate like that the scale at which India should be developing, right? It's really important for somebody to come in and build product companies. Don't think maybe a little beyond services and e-commerce. Like a lot of people are doing that very, very well. But I would love like if I think the one contribution that we had, and I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, is the map that we showed, right? Is that if more and more Indian companies come out and build global products, right? I think that will be the biggest accomplishment of what we have done, rather than just the business and the value that we add to our customers. Thank you.